All right, I think I'll get going here. So thank you everyone for attending today. Just a reminder for those that just logged on, there's a Q&A box that will send questions directly to me, or a chat box that I think everyone will be able to see. So any questions can be directed to either of those throughout the presentation, and I will answer them all at the end. So I'm Chelsea Cunningham, the Programs and now Engagement Manager here at SHRF. And so I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm here on Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon, but that Saskatchewan, obviously, we're spread out over numerous lands, and everyone hopefully is joining from all over. I'd just like to take a minute and acknowledge that. And hopefully not everyone's getting the same snow we're getting here today. And so we're here today. I'm going to talk about the Research Connections program. We have the applications open now for Research Connections grants, and this will also apply to all the future Research Connections calls as well. So first talk just a little bit about SHRF in case you're not familiar with us yet. A little bit about knowledge mobilization is and what we're hoping to achieve from the Research Connections program, a brief overview, eligibility of who can apply in the application process, and then a couple tips about what we look for in applications. So SHRF is the provincial research funding organization for Saskatchewan. And so our mandate really is to fund, support, and promote the impact of health research that matters to Saskatchewan. We view health research as vital. This is to improve the health of Saskatchewan citizens through a high-performing health ecosystem with a robust culture of research and innovation. And in this part, health research is vital, so SHRF is also vital in making sure that we're supporting the best health research in Saskatchewan. So knowledge mobilization can take quite a few forms, but it's really kind of the end of grant activities where you're trying to share the new results and research knowledge that has been gained, putting these into practical applications. So this can look like synthesis, interpreting and combining your findings to apply it to a specific context, exchange between the researchers and any knowledge users, application or implementation, so putting the research into practice or policy or however that might look, or dissemination, which is just generally communicating and sharing the research results, again, for the interested audiences or knowledge users that might be able to put this research into practice. So the purpose of the Research Connections program is really to increase research, health research relevance, usability, uptake. We do this by supporting short-term targeted knowledge mobilization activities. And as always, they have to be taking place in and having practical application for Saskatchewan knowledge users. And so as a note, we've been doing this for, I think, 2 years now, but the Research Connections program is only supporting knowledge mobilization activities. So this doesn't include health research related academic events, such as your academic research days, conferences. These can still be supported by SHRF, but we ask that you seek out sponsorship from us. I think the contact information for that should be in the Research Connections application package, or you can also just send me an email and I can direct you as appropriate. And so the pandemic is still ongoing. So we are allowing in-person events, but we do ask that the proposals and budgets address the consequences of switching to a virtual event, and try to keep the current situation in mind when you're developing proposals, since things can change quite quickly, we've seen. The objectives of the program. So our main objective here is really just to facilitate the sharing of health research knowledge, again, in a non-academic medium or setting. And then there's also some secondary objectives we have here that we'd like to see. We'd like to see that activity facilitates meaningful engagement between stakeholder groups, to help build effective relationships for future health research collaboration. Stakeholder groups is quite varied, so I can include communities, persons with lived and living experience, decision makers, health practitioners, etc. Or we'd like to see that the grants are being used to facilitate the use and integration of health research knowledge and evidence into practice and decision making. As contrast to last year, we've increased the amount of funding available again to 10,000, but keeping in mind that we're looking for reasonable budgets. SHRF is publicly funded, so it's up to 10,000, but you can really request any amount in there, whatever is needed to complete your activity. And we're still requiring equivalent or greater matching amounts in cash contributions or a combination of cash and in-kind contribution. And the cash contributions should make up 50% of your matching contributions. So you just have an example of the math there, where if you're requesting 6,000 from SHRF, there should be another 6,000 in matching contributions from various sources. And then that total cost for the budget is 12,000. And grants are for up to 1 year. Extensions are possible, especially given the COVID pandemic. We're being quite flexible with our deadlines. But we do look to see that the timelines are feasible when we're reviewing. So to keep in mind that 1 year term. So this year we've set out the deadlines for the research connections throughout the entire 22-23 year. So we have our first call here, the deadline on May 10th. The next one will be August 2nd, and the final one will be March 1st. And funding decisions will be made within 12 to 14 business days after each application deadline. This will be the only webinar for this spring, but it will be recorded and available online. And I will likely be doing a second one come winter. And if we do any focused research connections, those will be launched in addition to these details here. All right, so we'll get into the specifics of the applications. So first up is eligibility. So who can apply? So the only required role for research connections is the principal applicant, who is in charge of administering the grant funding and activities. Co-applicants can be added as needed to strengthen the application, but aren't required. And the principal applicant has to be from a Saskatchewan organization with health research interest, either one of the institutions with a memorandum of understanding with SHRF or a CRA qualified donee. And so those institutions are listed across the bottom with an MOU. The CRA qualified donee list, I believe, can be found online. And so the principal applicant can only submit one application per call, but we are doing 3 calls and we're treating those separately. And then eligibility of the project, things we are looking for. We want to see that the activity clearly supports the research connection purpose and objectives that I already described. It should foster the dissemination exchange of health research knowledge in Saskatchewan. This can be from any field, though. And we want to see it's based on legitimate and vetted research knowledge, whether that's your own research or research done elsewhere in your field, as long as it's been identified. And we want to see that the knowledge users are identified and their needs and potential benefits from the project are clear. And activities should also include a timely and concrete deliverable. So some examples that we've seen in the past of successful activities: we've had reports to inform policy. There's been the development of educational resources and translation of text to share more broadly to new audiences. There's been outreach activities to connect the knowledge users and other individuals with available resources that they might need, or to make new resources that are more accessible to them. There's also we also see a lot of activities compiling perspectives and lived experiences and how they relate to research to share stories. And we also have seen tech solutions to improve access to resources and care. That list obviously is not exhaustive. We always like to see new and innovative approaches. So if you have a good idea, I'm sure it can fit as long as you keep the purpose and objectives of the grant in mind. And then for the matching funding requirement, as I mentioned, there has to be 100% matching contributions, and at least 50% of that should be in the form of cash contributions. The main takeaway from this slide is operating grant funding, startup funding, and similar sources aren't eligible as matching funds. And so this is, that can be summarized as anything that is budgeted for research activities can't be used as matching funding because Research Connections is not funding research activities. So there are exceptions to this. Say if the knowledge mobilization activity was identified in the original funding application proposal and budget allocated for the activity, and you're using the Research Connections to build upon that original proposal and improve it. But this should be outlined in your application so that we can see where that original budget is coming from. And we also do any cash contributions or in-kind contributions. It's helpful to see some supporting documentation of where those are coming from when we're assessing engagement with your supporters. And then SHRF does reserve the right to conditionally award funding if the matching contributions are not confirmed at the time of submission. These must be confirmed in a timely manner, working with the SHRF program manager to release the funds. And then SHRF funds will be reduced to confirmed matching fund amount if the matching funds cannot be found. SHRF also reserves the right to reduce budgets if there are ineligible expenses proposed. I think I touched on that in another slide. So the allowable expenses is pretty open for this program. We just want to see that expenses are clearly justified and cover only direct cost. And again, we do look for the cost efficient options. We are publicly funded and we want to make sure there's enough money to go around for all the activities. And equipment is not normally eligible unless very clearly justified. And then there's also the SHRF funding guide, which has important policies which apply to all SHRF programs. And there's my note about we reserve the right to partially fund projects if they're ineligible expenses. We will usually ask you for clarification first before we make that decision. So the application is done in the SHRF RMS, same as any of our other grants. For this one, there are no contribution forms required. For those of you that have applied for other grants, you know those can sometimes be a bit more time consuming. So this one you can add co-applicants and they won't have to fill out any additional information on the application. And then the application form can be found on the homepage under funding opportunities. And we have a variety of support information for you. So there's this webinar. We also have the SHRF resource page, the SHRF funding guide. There's a RMS user manual and some YouTube how-to videos if you're having trouble navigating the RMS. And then for the review process, so these are not peer reviewed. They are just reviewed by an internal SHRF committee. And the list of considerations that we look at are listed in the application package. The main things, though, are we're really just looking at the who, what, where, and why, and justifications. I think I go into this a little bit more. So tips for applying. So read especially the application package. I'll emphasize just that one, I think, for the full grant information. As I mentioned, there's some questions there that we emphasize for the review criteria and all the requirements that are there. As I mentioned, co-applicants and supporters aren't required, but they can be very helpful to show the in-kind supports and engagement needed to complete this activity are in place. So that's one of the questions if you're answering, like, who is this activity for? We want to see that you engaged with this audience a bit and are meeting them, that they're engaged and that this activity is really going to be helpful for them and meet them where they're at. Especially for research connections, we want to see that there's engagement and that, yeah, it's more than just researchers sharing the information amongst themselves. The other tip is start the application early. If you are inviting co-applicants, they don't have to complete the contribution form, but they still do need to accept the invitation. So it's helpful to have extra time to complete that. The next tip was think through the budget and make sure it reflects your proposal. So to add on that as well, also with the timeline should match. The proposal, the timeline, and the budget should all be reflective of the same project. If we're comparing the 3 documents and there's some questions or things we're not quite sure where things fit, it can kind of detract from the overall impression of the grant. And then the last one is just to be clear and precise on the knowledge mobilization activity and how it relates to Saskatchewan and the knowledge users, which ties back to my point about having the engagement needed in place and to really have thought about your audience and what they need and what will be impactful for them to share this knowledge. So for context, there is myself and my email's there, and it's in the application package as well. And then if you're also running into any trouble in the RMS, Tanya is always around and extremely helpful. I don't know what we'd do without her. And I think that about covers everything I had prepared for today. So if there's any questions, you can add them into the chat box. Or if I think of any other points that I missed as I was talking, I'll just say them here. Right, so we have a question about SHRF grant funding, including that as supporting documents for the matching funding. And I would say yes, the answer is that that can be included as supporting documents for the matching funds. Especially, yeah, the follow-up note on this is that the funding, there is a portion allocated to knowledge mobilization and it had not been used yet due to COVID. So yeah, that's definitely eligible for matching funds and would be good to see as the supporting document. Oh, I guess a question that I have received in the past about ethics. So ethics approval usually isn't an eligible expense because that's only needed for research activities, and research connections research activities aren't eligible expenses. So that's something that's come up in the past that I've had to answer. Okay, we have another question about would funds be eligible to support a meeting with stakeholders to share research results and get their input on how it can be translated in a meaningful way? I would say yes. Just the key there would be to make sure that you're distinguishing it from a normal research day with stakeholders invited. So we'd want to see a little bit more meaningful engagement with the stakeholders up front, and more than just a research presentation, if that makes sense. But yeah, as long as the timeline and the deliverables are clear, it should be fine. Right, and then I'll stay online a few more minutes in case any more questions pop up. But thank you all for coming today and asking questions. And I hope to see applications from all of you coming up soon.